This is the Bounce Back Generation podcast. I'm Jennifer Dillon. Power sharing versus power hoarding. What's the difference? And who needs to understand the dynamics of power in order to function better in a school, in a classroom? This is a podcast that is especially relevant for teachers today, teaching in a post COVID environment. Joining us is S.J. Janjua. They are the founder and head consultant of Empowerment for Equity Consulting, where they work with schools and organizations, creating more inclusive environments for all people, including LGBTQ+. And SJ's main goal is always to leave people feeling more empowered after working with them. You know, it's interesting. I was on social media, I don't remember where, and I saw, this kind of teacher comes up and she says, I have been doing this for 28 years. She's like, almost crying
Mhm.
and said, I quit. I can't do it anymore.
Yeah.
And her point was that, particularly after COVID, she spends so much of her time in each classroom getting the kids managed, kind
Mhm.
of. And she said, I can't, I don't teach anymore. I manage behavior.
Yeah.
And one of the things at Bounce Back Generation that we do is, some of this teacher training and particularly around burnout. And the teachers that I've spoken to, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, that feel like they can stay in the profession, seem to have accepted that their role as teachers now is to manage behavior first
Mhm.
and then teach,
Yeah.
and that you're really bringing up you're part of the community around these kids that will help them learn how to manage their emotional
Mhm.
life, their mental health. And that's a big thing to put on teachers, particularly when
Yes.
it's not. I mean, did you get a lot of mental health training as a teacher?
None. 0. Yeah. And yeah, this is something we're seeing across the board, at least in the United States, about with teaching is that post virtual learning, post COVID, the behavior and classroom management piece has overcome the entirety of the class time is spent managing that. And so we are seeing that a lot in all grade levels, not just elementary, not just high school. We're seeing it everywhere. And a lot of people have different opinions on why that is. Because of COVID and lockdown, parents were working at home while kids were on screens doing school, and there wasn't a lot of oversight, or there just was a big disruption to everyone's lives, and that can cause a lot of issues. But also the fact that there were a lot of things we're seeing come out of COVID lockdown, with mental health, like you said, with COVID learning loss. There's a lot of things like that in the education space that are being talked about. Um, because, as adults, we struggled, with COVID lockdown, and the kids did too. In a lot of ways, a lot of them have missed this big, developmental chunk of school, because for some, if they're, going into another grade, going into another school, like from middle school to high school, or elementary to middle school, that's gonna be a really hard transition for them when they are doing it on a screen, and then they have to actually go to that school a year later. Again, it's another expectation that we're putting on teachers, that now you have to be a therapist.
Yeah.
Now you have to manage the students' mental health as well. And something that I talk a lot about when I do work with schools on LGBTQ plus inclusion is that I talk about the fact that students are at school for 12 years of their lives. Most of their day, they're at school. They might be with you as their teacher more than they're with their own parents or caregivers. And so the impression that you make on them, and the creation of a safe space and inclusive space for them in your classroom, is really high priority, because they might, also might be coming from a home that's doesn't feel safe and affirming to them. Your students are watching how you deal with conflict, how you address different things throughout the day, whether you realize it or not. You're modeling for them how to deal with that, how to have good peer-to-peer relationships, how to manage your stress, and all of these things. And so you have to kind of be on all, and that's a lot of pressure to put on someone.
Well, that's something, we're developing a toolkit for teachers that is about that. And I think there's a couple of points that you're making that are really interesting. And one is, I think there's an expectation that teachers need to be therapists.
Mm,
And because we live in a society that says, oh, you have a mental health problem, go see a therapist.
yeah.
And skipping over the fact that we are a large community around kids all the time. And
Mhm.
you never know the next door neighbor, the mom,
Right.
friend across the street, the coach, and the teacher are all part of that. And the other point that's really important is that I think there's a feeling like these kids are showing up and they have mental health issues, and I need to fix them as if I'm the
Mhm.
healer.
Yeah.
And you're not. I think as a teacher, like you said, you can model, you can demonstrate. But the other thing is that you're teaching. You're
Mhm.
teaching some, and that's what we offer in our toolkit. There
Yeah.
are things that you can do to teach positive mental health
Mhm.
skills.
Yes.
And young children are not responsible for their mental health. That's what
Mhm.
adults do. But as they get older, you start to share, these are the things you do. Here's how I deal with the fact that I'm having the worst day ever and I have a headache,
Mhm.
and I just fought with my best friend, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to buy the lunch that I want to buy because I don't have enough money or whatever. And
Mhm.
here's how I deal with it.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a lot of positive potential there once we get out of the thinking that every single kid needs a social worker therapist
Mhm.
team around them.
Yes.
Some of them do, of course.
Mhm.
And there's but if you want to give everybody a therapist, it's one of our sayings, there are not enough therapists in the world
Yeah.
to help us. So that really brings up how let's talk a little bit about the DEI and belonging
Yeah.
training, because I think
Mhm.
that's a really important part of it, and I love that belonging is part of it because,
Yeah.
you know, DEI has become, yet another, just like pronouns become another buzzword of like, "Oh, we don't
Mhm.
like DEI."
Yeah.
But let's talk about why DEI and belonging, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging training
Mhm.
are so important to kids in school, not as an indoctrination, but as a way to try to create atmospheres in which they are pleasant, they are
Mhm.
protected, safe atmospheres where kids go to school and they don't feel terrorized by
Yeah.
other kids or by the environment. So if you could talk about that, I think hopefully people will listen and not just jump to a conclusion that you're trying to indoctrinate kids into something terrible.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, that's the thing is, I think belonging is something that we can all rally around that's important. All of us at one point or another in our lives have felt left out or felt othered for whatever reason. I know I've had a lot of experiences in my life where I felt like that. Being a trans person, being a queer person, being multiracial, there are many reasons why I've felt othered in my life, and why belonging is so important to me, and why that piece for me needs to be in there, especially in schools, because something, that I talk a lot about is also bullying and how that can, alienate students, and there are students that are leaving schools because of the bullying situation, or different things like that. And
There are
so,
students who are committing suicide
well,
because of
yeah,
bullying,
absolutely. Yeah,
even
I
if
mean
it's online,
yeah,
not even in person.
there's so many grave things that come out of bullying. And this is something, bullying, that has been going on forever, it feels like. I mean, people experienced bullying centuries ago in school and they're still experiencing it now. And we have to get to the root of like, why is that? And it's because we've taught people that if they're different, you shouldn't like them, or you should cast them out, or they should be, kind of on the fringes of society. And that's something obviously we don't want our young people to take into society with them. We don't want them to think that just because someone has a different lived experience than you, just because someone looks different than you, or identifies differently than you, doesn't mean that they're wrong, right? It doesn't mean that they are, any less than because of those things. And so part of the belonging piece for me when I work with schools is really working on school culture. What does your school culture look like? Is it a place where students feel safe and affirmed and like they can be their full selves? Is it somewhere that they don't feel those things? And why? can we get to the root of why that is? Is it because you have policies and procedures in place that don't respect, differences in different ways of being, or knowing? Do we have, policies in place that respect that or don't? And so my first, thing that I really look at with those trainings is, let's talk about your school culture a little bit, and let's talk about what that looks like. And a lot of the time, schools are like, I don't know what you're talking about. I
Mhm.
don't know. I can't pinpoint exactly what you're saying when you talk about school culture. And that's alarming to me in a lot of ways. And I do work with schools on doing like culture assessments sometimes, which is like a big process with surveys and focus groups and all of that. But it's a really good way to like kind of nail down exactly what are your students not getting that they need to be getting here, to feel connected to their school community. There are so many wonderful studies out there about what happens when students feel connected to their school community. You're seeing absenteeism is at zero practically. You're seeing that grades are high, test scores are high. I don't, kids are graduating on time because they feel connected to their school community. Of course, they want to come to school. They're excited to come to
Right.
school because they feel connected. I didn't have that. I didn't have that connection to school culture. And a lot of the time when I ask people to reflect on their experience in school, it's either it was horrible or it was amazing. I never
Mhm.
really hear the in between. And so I think that's another topic, but that's something that I ask a lot is like, let's reflect on what your experience like was in school. And if you felt really connected to your school community, why was that? What was your school doing that made it that way? And a lot of the answers that I get from that is taking the time to build school community and school culture, and the school really being a staple in that community that it exists within. And it's not just a place you go to learn; it's a place you go to be in community with other people your age or like you, or having these different clubs, and just like really making sure that everybody feels celebrated for exactly who they are there.
One of the simplest ways that I have asked principals and vice principals to think about their school and that kind of culture
Mhm.
is walk yourself into school as if you're a student.
Yeah.
Do the drop off. How does that feel? Do the, walk into the classroom, entering the classroom,
Mhm.
and think about it from all the different ages and what's going on developmentally with them. What happens what's going on in the playground or
Yeah.
break time or lunchtime.
Mhm.
And when they saw it that way, they're like, oh yeah, well, wow, look, we just ring the bell and then they come into class and they slam the door and there's nobody there
Mhm.
greeting them, or that, then all of a sudden all these ideas come up of how they can be doing things differently.
Yeah.
And you're right, it's the glue that holds the school together, is
Mhm.
that culture. I want to go back to what you're talking about with bullying.
Mhm.
I find it so interesting that the need to other is such a deep, almost a human need that we have
Mhm.
to separate ourselves. I'm not like them.
Mhm.
And do you have thoughts about that? Kind of, I think there's an evolutionary kind of,
Yeah.
maybe it's something in our DNA. It's about our fear factor coming up, our fight or
Mhm.
flight. What do you think about that in terms of
Yeah. I mean, I agree in that I think it is like an innately human thing to like categorize ourselves. I mean, I see that with the work I do with LGBTQ plus inclusion too. It's like we feel like we need to label ourselves. We feel like we need to categorize everything. And I think that's just part of being human, is like we categorize so that we can figure people out, or figure out where we need to place them on a scale of importance to us, or things like that. And I think othering has a factor in there too. I think it kind of has to do with hierarchy, and how society has been designed that way to like have this hierarchy in there. It goes back to all of these really deeply ingrained, like horrible systems that we have in place in this country, to categorize people so that we can say, like you said, we're not like them, or they're bad and we're good. And again, we get into this binary thinking of like good and bad, or, important or not important, or all of these different things. And I think we don't leave enough room for the gray area. What about someone just being who they are, or what about, I don't know. I just think that like we like to put people in boxes, and say we know who that person is just by looking at them, or we know who that person is just by what they said. We even see it today with like cancel culture, right? It's like one person does something bad once and we're like, that person's bad, right?
Right.
We're unfollowing, we're dragging them on the internet, we're doing all this stuff so that everybody knows this person is horrible.
Right.
But we don't leave room for that person to learn from that and then, repair after they've done something horrible. It's okay to make a mistake and then repair it and be okay. We don't have to label that person as someone that's bad forever because they did one thing publicly that, was wrong or was bad.
When you were talking, I was remembering a study. It was actually like a National Geographic study,
Mhm,
where they videotaped a bunch of monkeys. I don't remember what kind,
mhm,
and the monkey cultures or societies are very hierarchical.
mhm, yeah,
You've got the top one, and then there's a deputy, etc.
mhm,
And what they did is they went in and they took stress hormones
mhm,
samples
yeah,
from, and what they found was the one at the top, stress hormone was very low. They were happy. They were just kind of
mhm.
bathed in their dopamine and serotonin.
Yeah.
Everything was great. And the one at the very bottom was just a complete stressed out,
Mm,
high markers for cortisol, which is
yeah.
the stress hormone. And so I think the bullying, if, kind of picking someone out to bully, saying that category of people, someone's gay or they're a different color than me or
Mhm.
whatever, is very, and the canceling satisfies some sort of need to keep ourselves away from that stress hormone,
Mhm.
because we
Yeah.
know that anytime I feel dominant over somebody, my stress level goes down. And
Mhm.
I know, I mean, my friends and I will talk all the time about, well, I can't believe that this so and so in that political party, wow, what an idiot, and
Mhm.
there's a little burst of like, yeah, so much better about
Yeah.
myself than because I'm not that person.
Mhm.
So, how do we, knowing that about ourselves as humans, and I think you talked about this a little bit, is that as educators, is you rise above that. You don't, and
Mhm.
that's what you're training with um, DEIB
Mhm.
is about teaching people. You don't have to succumb to these very basic urges that we
Yeah.
have. You can recognize them, analyze them, kind of turn them around and say, "Do I
Mhm.
really need to do this to another person in order for
Yeah.
me to feel good?" So, how would you, let's say that there's a kid listening right now and says, "Look, I'm being bullied. I get it. It makes bully feels great when they bully
Mhm.
me." Um, and recognizing, I think, that when the bully bullies you, it also helps them deal with their own sense of inadequacy, because
Mhm.
obviously they need to make you feel bad in order to
Yeah.
feel better, right? So
Mhm.
how, as a teacher, would you help the kid that is not only being bullied, but also the bully themselves
Yeah.
to change their attitudes or behaviors? Because
Yeah.
that's what we do as we're civilized, means that we are
Mhm.
not, kind of going on our monkey urges to just
Yeah.
dominate. I'm on top.
Yeah, I mean, and this is like such an important perspective way to look at it, is like, how would you talk to both of these parties that are involved in this like cycle of harm and all of that. And I think something that I always bring up is that, one, we need to start talking about difference and celebrating difference early in life. That is something that I think is extremely important, is to do that from a young age. Is to really talk about differences, talk about how we can celebrate other people's differences, because hate is not something that we come into the world with, right? It's something that's taught, it's a learned behavior. they're picking that up somewhere. The student that's bullying, they're picking up the fact that they need to do that somewhere. Oftentimes it's at home, unfortunately. They're in a situation where their parent or their sibling or someone around them is bullying them. And like you said, they need to bully somebody else to make them feel better, or they feel inadequate in some way, maybe in the classroom. The kid that's getting bullied is really smart and is always answering the questions right. And the bully was getting called on and getting it wrong. And I think a big opportunity in this scenario as a teacher is to talk about the impact of using restorative practices to mitigate conflict. I think that's a big thing that a lot of teachers can leverage. That I work with some schools on it, but it's not something that I see enough out
Can
there.
you describe what just
Yeah,
maybe do a
yeah.
scenario what restorative practice would look
Mhm.
like?
Yeah, so let's say there's, a kid this kid's getting bullied, and the bully's in the class with them, and so the teacher in that scenario would pull both parties together at a separate occasion, so not during class, obviously, because there's a million things going on. They could do this a couple different ways, but, they could have a restorative circle, which is basically an opportunity for the kid that's getting bullied to say, "Hey, this was not okay with me, and this is how you harmed me, and this is the impact that it had on me." And then the bully gets to talk about why they felt the need to do that. And it can also be a little more reflective than that. So you can have reflection time and then you come together and talk about it. But a lot of the times, what we see is labeling, this is bullying, here's punishment for that, right? And a
Mhm.
lot of the time it's punishment that's like, you have detention, or you are going to get written up, or you're going to, be out of school suspension or in school suspension. These things that we know that don't work, because they're taken from the prison industrial complex, and which again is another topic for another day. But these things that are not restorative, they're not helping us get anywhere. It's just like that bully gets punished. They have time to think about it, which they're not doing because we're not teaching them how to reflect on that behavior and the impact that your behavior has on other people. They come back from that suspension or that time away and they do it again because they're mad, right? They're mad that they got in trouble for it. And then it's the same cycle over and over again. So we have to do something that repairs the harm, and
Mhm.
allows both students or the group of students to make repair and learn how to make repair when something like this happens. And that's something that we don't teach people and that we just hope they figure out, right? But
Yeah.
you have to teach your kids that. You have to teach your students that because they don't just know. But when you're in that situation where both, parties get an opportunity to talk about their experience, and what they felt as a result of the bullying, or maybe the bully talks about why they felt the need to do that, you get to another place with it. You get deeper with it, and the bully's able to then understand, I shouldn't be doing these things because it's impacting so many parts of this other student's life. Restorative practices are something that should be utilized more in schools, but they have to be set up correctly and
Mhm.
done correctly because they can cause more harm if you don't
Yeah.
do them correctly. So get a professional in there to train your staff on how to do it, because if you just try to Google it and watch some YouTube videos and then do it, it can do a lot more harm.
It can
So
backfire.
exactly.
Yeah, and I think what's a big missing piece of restorative justice that I've personally witnessed is the lack of understanding of power dynamics.
Yes.
What is behind someone seeking power,
Mhm.
needing power, and there's a certain level, a certain percentage that just really love to make people feel bad, and there's
Yeah.
no self-reflection in it. It just feels good. They're never going to reflect back, and that's what we
Mhm.
call sociopath, right?
Yeah.
But that's a very small percentage, and I think most kids do want power because personal power is so important.
Yeah.
And they don't understand that if I get power by making somebody feel bad, it's not authentic power.
Mhm.
And that gets us to kind of what Coach Lee talks about, which is
Yeah.
being your authentic self. How do you
Mhm.
actually get to that place?
Yeah.
And I think that's another thing that can be taught. And where does personal power come in the conversation around DEIB?
Yeah, I mean, I think power is something that I actually talk about a lot. Not necessarily in the school space, but when I work with organizations, a lot of it's like, who's making the decisions here? Who has the power? And power is something that can be wielded for good or for bad, and in between, of course, too. But I've worked with a lot of organizations that are like, our organization is super hierarchical, and the person at the top has the most power. They are the one that gets to the last say in everything. They might ask, the employees for feedback, but they're kind of just doing that to say they did it and not really taking that into consideration. And I mean, it's a big equity sticking point, right? When one person has all that power, that's not good, because it's not representative of all of the amazing and unique people that you have at that organization, or corporation, or whatever structure you have in place. But you're actually doing the organization a huge disservice by being like, I'm the only one that gets to do this. Because think about all the other people that might have amazing ideas that could be so beneficial, that are not actually getting to share those in a productive way, or in a way that like serves them at all, because this one person at the top, or a couple people at the top, are kind of, gatekeeping the power in a way. And I always talk about how, power hoarding is also, an aspect of white supremacy culture, and that, getting into that deeper is a really important part to looking at that, and examining, like, why is it like this, and how can we break down how power is shared or can be shared in this space. Sometimes it's an aha moment for folks, and then sometimes it makes them hang on to that power even
Mm,
more than they did before, because then they're scared about losing it. And so it's a process, and it's something that sometimes can take a very long time, and some people, it will never get through, because they're too concerned about not having the power.
yeah.
And so that's something that I've seen play out in a lot of different ways when I've worked with organizations, and also with schools. It can be that way too, because if admin is the only person that's making decisions, they're not in the classroom with the students every single day. Wouldn't the people that are in the classroom with the students every single day have the best perspective of what's best for the students, not the people that are not in the classroom with them every day? I
Mhm.
think that's something that I see a lot too, is that like, oh, well, I have to jump through all these hoops to get anything done on a higher level with administration. And so as a teacher, I'm not going to waste my time, because they're probably just going to say no anyway. But it's such a disservice to the school, because you're really not supporting your students if you're just making a decision based on what you think is going on, when that's probably not actually what's going on. And there's a lot of nuance to the situation that you couldn't know unless you're in the classroom with them every day.
Something that you brought up a couple of times is the kind of white supremacy background to
Mhm.
all of this, but in the United States. And unfortunately, though, of course, it is factually correct, it is a barrier to people who are not in, a person of color or LGBTQ or the kind of traditional other.
Mhm.
It's such a block for them to
Yeah.
understand what this is about because they hear white supremacy and they say, "Oh, I'm white, so you're
Mhm.
attacking me." And
Yep.
I like the perspective that from the book Caste, that
Mhm.
I'm part Indian from India,
Mhm.
and which is where the caste system,
Yeah.
has flourished and is still flourishes and comes from.
Mhm.
And we're all brown people, right?
Yeah.
So, and some are more brown than others, and they get, deemed the untouchables. And some,
Mhm.
like, lighter skin complexion get to, have all the goodies, right?
Yeah.
So this is again another, kind of human thing that we do where we try to
Mhm.
separate ourselves, make ourselves more comfortable, putting other people down. And how can we continue this conversation as we move through the next couple of years? God knows what's going to happen kind of
Mhm.
politically or with the world structure and things like that, that we talk about these things and get everyone in the conversation to recognize I do it too,
Yep.
whether it's my part of my race
or it's part of my personality to put
Mhm.
people down and try to separate myself and make myself more important than you.
Yeah.
How do we have that conversation?
Yeah. And like you said, it is tricky, because a lot of people, they don't wanna ever be in the wrong, right? And they don't wanna publicly be in the wrong. They don't wanna feel like they did something wrong, and there's so much fear around accepting that we're all gonna do things that are wrong sometimes. Sometimes we don't have the information we need in order to do better. There have been many times in my life that I have not had the information I needed in order to do better in a situation. And I think just being really open about that, especially when I'm talking about white supremacy culture or, just a lot of different topics. I notice people start turning the cameras off or they start averting their eyes when I'm in public with them. And things like that. And you can feel the energy shift in the room when you start talking about things like that. And it's very important for us to name the thing. But I also find that sometimes not naming it is more successful.
Mhm.
And maybe later on down the road we can name it when we get a little more comfortable and we feel like okay, we're at a point where we can hit this head on and we can talk about it. But sometimes at the beginning, you got to start really, really slow and you have
Mhm.
to be gentle with people, even people who are doing immense harm, which is very hard. But you have to allow grace for people who have done horrible things sometimes. And we all have to understand that we're all gonna make mistakes. We're all gonna say the wrong thing, do the wrong thing, whatever. We're all gonna harm each other. That's part of being human is stepping on each other's toes and saying the wrong thing and hurting each other. But it's all about the repair, right? What do we do when we say the wrong thing, when we do the wrong thing? How do we repair after that?
Can we create a dialogue that makes people not feel like doing the right thing in terms of being open to other
Hmm.
people and cultures doesn't also mean I have to attack myself?
Yeah.
And I think that's unfortunately the message that a lot of people have gotten out of DEI training is that
Hmm.
if I'm not part of one of those groups, those
Yeah.
other groups, it's my fault personally
Hmm.
and all my people, and I have to grovel and say I'm
Yeah.
sorry for things that I don't even know what happened,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And that's a terrible thing because that's not the message,
Not at
obviously,
all.
but
Yeah.
that's what people hear.
Hmm. Yeah. No,
So,
that's definitely so there has to be, like you said, a dialogue that we have that's not pitting groups against each other, right?
mhm,
That's not the goal of this. And I think naming that at the beginning is very important and saying, like, this is not a space that's meant to be divisive. This is not a space where we are going to um, close ourselves off to things and really just like setting the expectation of that at the beginning of a session or conversation, I think is really vital to making sure that that doesn't happen, but it still can happen along the way, of course.
yeah,
Like, I've had that happen many times where people are all open and ready to go at the beginning, and we're chatting and everything's good, and then somebody says something and they're like,
and it's like,
"Oh." Yeah, and then you just see them shut down, and then they disengage from the rest of the session, and, yeah.
Yeah, I see 2 things happening. One is that the 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 group that is considered the supreme group, the
Mhm,
they feel blamed. And then
mhm.
I see on the other side, the othered group feels like they've been made responsible for explaining everything.
Yeah.
Like
Mhm.
I have to tell you, okay, this is why I feel like this. This is why my ancestors felt like
Yep.
this. This is why I carry this
Mhm.
trauma. And then the people who are the more in power are like,
Mhm.
well, I didn't do that to you. So then we
Yeah.
end up just having a nothing conversation or an
Mhm.
argument. So why should I care about pronouns?
Yeah, so this is a question that I actually get asked a lot in the work that I do is why does that matter, right? You're either a man or a woman. There's nothing else, that you could potentially be. And when I answer this question, I always preface it by saying, that there are so many gender identities that exist already, but also ones that have yet to be discovered. And so we always want to make sure that we are respecting people by what they want to be referred to as. It's really comes down to a matter of respect. The same way that we respect people in knowing someone's name, the name that they want to be called, and like pronouncing someone's last name correctly or first name correctly, giving them that respect. We also want to give them that respect in honoring how they would like us to refer to them, because we're not always going to use their name, right? We sometimes are going to have to use pronouns when we're talking about someone, and so we really want to make sure that we're really just honoring what that person is telling us is respectful to them. Also, that we aren't just stopping at pronouns. That's something I also like to bring up as well, is pronouns are a very, very, very small piece of the puzzle when it comes to trans inclusion, LGBTQ plus inclusion. We don't want to just stop at memorizing someone's pronouns, because their pronouns are not all of who they are.
So, how would you address somebody who says, "Look, I want to be a respectful person, but you're asking me to acknowledge something that I don't believe in. You know, I grew up
Mm,
in a Christian household, or I grew up in a certain way, and I think that there's only male and female, and now this is clashing with my
mm.
ideas."
Yeah, and that is something that I hear quite a bit. I like to come from a place of curiosity rather than attacking someone and being like, that's not right. Because a lot of people don't respond well to that, right? They don't respond well to being called out or someone telling them that they're wrong, and things like that. So I always try to come from a place of curiosity of like, that's an interesting thought. Where did you learn that in your life? And maybe it's being Christian and going to church, and that's where you learned that, or maybe it was from your parents, or maybe through, society or media that you've consumed over time, and really just kind of digging into where the root of that is, because when we get to the root of why someone believes that, that's when we can kind of start to sometimes it has to be planting seeds a little bit and saying, let's try to open our minds a little bit to think a little bit deeper into what this could look like. And sometimes you can be a little bit more direct with the education piece of it. Growing up in this society that's super binary and has taught us that pink is for girls and blue is for boys and everything is so gendered. So usually people say to me, oh, well, I learned this, through society, through my parents, through, my upbringing was really gendered, things like that. And so it kind of just gives me a better picture of where they picked that thought up and why that has continued throughout their life, and how they can maybe open their minds a little bit more.
Clearly you're an educator. You're educating us right now about how to kind of approach these situations. So what made you decide that that was, where did you kind of come up with like, this is what I want to do?
Yeah, it's actually a funny story because my entire like childhood, I really wanted to be a veterinarian. I was like super into that. I love animals, and I always was like, I want to work with animals in some capacity. And so I got in my mind that I wanted to be a vet. And once I started to get to like around middle school age, I started getting into like more complicated math and science. And I found that I'm just not very good at math and science at all. I'm very, very good at English and history, kind of the more humanities based things. And I actually was more interested in English and history and humanities and anthropology and things like that. So I kind of went on this journey to kind of figure out what it was that I would excel in, and that what I could be passionate about. I really started to learn about the inequities in education, and that's really what drove my passion, and what honestly keeps me still working in education spaces today is the inequities that exist, and how we can change things. So it wasn't always a dream for me, but it was always something that kind of came naturally to me.
So when you talk about the inequities in education, can you maybe give us like the top three ways in which we see inequity in
Mm,
education kind of playing out? Because a lot of
yeah.
people will say, actually, I just saw an article this morning that 1 in 3 African Americans say that Brown versus Board of Education did not actually change things
Mhm.
for them.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot. Narrowing it down to 3 is tricky.
I know, that's what I did
There's
it.
so many. But I think I don't know where this ranks in the top 3. It's in there, but it's not. I don't know if it's 1, if it's 2, or if it's 3. But teacher pay is always something I bring up. As a country, have a really, really poor attitude towards the appreciation we show for educators. In a lot of other countries, it is one of the top highest paying jobs, the most revered jobs in a lot of countries is to be a teacher, because you're basically keeping the economy going, right? You're teaching children so that they can then one day go into the workforce. We're doing that here as well, but it's not, we're not seeing that same level of appreciation as a society for educators. It's not as an appreciated profession to go into. It's always if you can't do, teach, or that kind of thing. And it's like, it's ridiculous, because honestly, if you can teach, you can do anything. That's my opinion, and that's something that I still hold like very near and dear to my heart. Is like, I've gotten the attention of 30 16-year-olds in a classroom, for 90 minutes or whatever, and that's very difficult to do. So if you can teach, in my opinion, you can do any other job. And I think that's also connected to teacher burnout, which is something I talk a lot about, because it is something that I've experienced myself, and something that is running our education system ragged in this country specifically, especially post-COVID, pandemic, virtual learning time. It definitely, we're seeing teachers leaving the profession in droves, and the numbers are higher really than they've ever been. So I think there is a lot of inequity that's tied to that, because we're expected as teachers to, teach classes for 6 or 7 hours a day, in addition to preparing lessons for the next day, sponsoring extracurricular activities, coaching sports, taking care of our own families, and then still having time for ourselves somewhere in there, which I think there's this perception that, teachers need to give their students 110% all the time. And then if you give your students 110% all the time, what do you have left for yourself
Mhm.
at the end of the day?
All right. Well, this has been super interesting. And I just have one final question for
Okay.
you, which is a question we ask all of our guests is who made a difference for you when you were growing up? And the reason we ask that question is because I think, and as an educator, I think you can confirm this, that so many of us don't know how those little moments that we have with
Mhm.
people make such a huge difference. So I'd
Yeah.
love to hear your story.
Absolutely. I love this question for a lot of reasons. And what I'm about to say will probably sound cliche, because I was an educator and am an educator, but teachers, I had so many amazing teachers who really made me feel seen, and heard. I was an extremely shy, introverted kid, and I moved around a lot when I was growing up, so I was always the new kid, which was super isolating for me, because being shy, I was like, I don't want to talk to anybody. I don't want to stick out for any reason. I don't want to be the center of attention. But naturally, as a new kid, everyone's asking you all these questions. Who are you? Where did you come from? All this stuff. And I always felt so isolated by that situation. And I had so many teachers that just looked out for me and checked on me and made sure that I was okay. And I had a teacher in middle school that would let me come to her classroom after school, and it was always under the guise of like helping her get ready for the next day, but really we would just chat, and she wanted to know about me. She wanted to know about what my thoughts and feelings were about things. And I grew up in a family where we just didn't talk about our feelings at all. And it was really hard for me, because as a kid that was, very shy and introverted, but very emotional and sensitive, I didn't have anywhere to put that. And so
Mm.
I kind of just bottled it up. But being able to have somewhere to go, and someone that was interested in me, and asked me questions about my thoughts and feelings was really, really powerful for me. I also had a coach I was really into sports. I was an athlete in middle school and high school, and I had a coach who also was an out lesbian, and she, this was in Texas, which is where I'm from, and which is, not the best place to be queer.
Right.
But she didn't talk about her sexuality a lot, but she just had this presence, and was also somebody that kind of just took me under her wing and like really made sure that I was seen and heard, and just really was that representation for me as a kid that, I didn't have. She was the most visibly, queer person that I had in my life growing up, and someone that was happy and successful, and doing all these great things.
That's great. It's amazing how many people say teachers.
Yeah.
Teachers, and you know who's the second is aunts and uncles. One more thing before we go. Please make sure to subscribe and, of course, like and do all of those things. It's really helpful for us. We're a nonprofit, and everything that we offer is for free. So it's a good way for us to know that people are interested in the topics that we're covering. Thank you for listening. I'm Jennifer Dillon. Our producer is Liam Donaldson, and music by Jogging Turtle. I hope you'll join us. And again, and please check out our website, bbgtv.org, and our YouTube channel, bbgtv.org.